thoughts is if you just wanted the rice. The curry was okay. I mean, it had a little bit of spice. I put a little bit more cayenne than I intended, but it didn't bother me because I like spicy to a point. But I didn't have any of the lentil stuff.
Oh, okay.
No. I had a little bit of whatever Max brought. Whatever that thing was.
Talking tonight on Epiphanic Theology. Yeah, big words. Basically, it is the unknowability of God. As such, there's nothing I can say, so. Sorry, that is a little snarky, but there's a real truth to that. We're talking about what we don't know. And the church would say, what we cannot know. Also going to have to apologize tonight. I left my reading glasses at home. My regular glasses, coatings were coming off of them. And went to the eye doctor, and he wouldn't give me a new prescription. He says my cataracts are so bad that it wouldn't do any good. But if you see me driving, don't worry. I can legally drive without glasses. So. But it's a little hard getting through here. I want to deal with three things. One is, what do we mean by Epiphanic theology? What the type of language that it is. And then I want to cover a bit of the history of Epiphanic theology. And then I want to end up with some sort of practical type of issues of what this really means to the church, of how we live it out, how it affects Orthodox thinking. We know things by analogy. How many of you know what a lacrosse ball is?
A what?
Lacrosse ball. Okay. When we don't know things, we tend to explain them in terms of other things that we do know. We explain them by analogy. So if I told you it was the size of a tennis ball, you probably know what a tennis ball is. But if I said it was hard rather than soft, and it was hard, sort of like the old Super Balls we used to play with, but it's not as bouncy and it doesn't crack, that would give you some idea of what I'm talking about.
You know what Super Bowl is?
They were really hard balls you used to have, and you'd throw them and just bounce all over the place. But we tend to think of things and we know things by comparisons. It tastes like chicken, as we often hear. An analogy, a comparison. We compare something we don't know to something we do know. The problem comes is, what do you do with something that has no analogy? Because when all the things that we do know are a part of the creation, how can we know something that's not a part of the creation? There's nothing we can have an analogy, a similarity to it, to be able to say what it is. We end up using a language that's negative. God is immortal, immaterial, invisible, undivided, uncreated. All these prefixes that are negations, saying what it is not. Uncreated. We know what created things are. We know how to create soups. We know how to create these things. But what is uncreated? We're saying it's not, but we really don't know what it is we're saying it is. And so apophatic theology are all these negatives. It's not this, it's not that, it's not that. Blocking off, but not giving us anything concretely to understand what it is. This is what Jesus means when he says that no one can know the Father but the Son. The Son can know the Father because the Son is God. but no one else can understand the essence, the real nature of God. And this is the dilemma of what is God? What do we mean when we use that word? What are we describing? Or what are we trying to talk about? And this is an old problem that's been around before Christianity. You've always had the philosophers trying to get a handle on God, defining God. What do they mean by it? Plato, there's a famous story that he has called the cave. Because he sees reality is like a person who's tied up in a cave. And they can see the wall of the cave in front of them, and there's a fire behind them. And as people walk behind them in front of the fire, there's shadows that are up on the wall. The person sitting there can see the shadows, but they can't see the reality. And in Plato's thinking, that was the nature of God. God we could only know through these shadows and not know who God really was. And this developed into what was called Neoplatonism. There's a person by the name of Plotinus who was a philosopher teacher who taught this. And there's this idea of simplicity that in old thinking, complexity means things are divided. And the purer things are, the less divided they are. It's sort of like in mathematics, the simplest thing you can have is a point. You can't divide it. There's no space between it. And so for Plotinus and these people, simplicity was the ultimate nature of God. But Augustine comes along and he says that if you conceive of something, it's not God. If you conceive of the simplicity of a point, your simplicity is not God. There are three people who we associate with this mystical theology of God in particular. Dionysius the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, and Gregory Palamas. Maximus was actually a student of Plotinus. And so these are people in their writings, they are using this Neoplatonic language all over the place, building their theology using these terms of God who is beyond, the God who is unknowable. But they are not Neoplatonists. Where Plotinus sees the ultimate as being simplicity, to them the ultimate is Trinity. It's almost what they're saying is the Neoplatonists are not radical enough. They don't push their unknowing far enough to realize you can't say anything. You can't call it simplicity. You can't call it anything other than what God has revealed to us, that God is Trinity, that God is mystery. It's Gregory Palamas. It's not that he thought it out better or differently, but his language is the language the church sort of adopted to try to deal with this. And what you get, Gregory Palamas, there was this famous debate between him and another theologian by the name of Barlaam, who came out of Western scholasticism. And Barlaam is offended when he goes to Mount Athos, because there are these truly illiterate monks there on Mount Athos claiming to know God. And for Barlaam, who's been brought up in this academic scholastic world, whose belief is that the highest understanding that you can have of God is the contemplation of the concept of God, the simplicity of God, that you can't really know God for these monks to say that they know God is just, you're too stupid to realize that you don't know what you're talking about in his thinking. Barlam is coming along with a lot of the ideas out of Aristotle. Aristotle is the one who has these classic arguments of proving that God exists. What's the nature of God? That there must be an all-powerful being if we understand power. And it's oftentimes used as apologetics, but the church, in a sense, says we don't even go there. Because even to talk about these concepts, you don't understand the total unknowability of God. But for Barlam to contemplate these ideas of this all-powerful, all-knowing, ultimate being, that was what it meant, the closest you could get to the idea of knowing God, which these monks just can't even begin to comprehend these ideas. And Palamas is coming along and saying, these monks understand the truth. Because the truth is not in philosophy. The truth is in the experience of God. And I'm not going to get into it too much, but he develops this language of essence and energy. Basically, these are just labels so I can say this is not this, but it is still this, and therefore this is okay. The essence is what is something in and of itself. What's the interior working of God? What's the nature of God? And for Palamas, that essence of God, we can't even speak about it. We can't know it. There's nothing that we can deal with there. But yet this strange God has made himself known through his energies. Now the West at times wants to see energy as something that God creates. It looks as grace, as something that God gives, something God creates, he makes. But Palamas is very strong and very clear that the energy of God is God himself. You can call it grace, you can call it the love of God. It is not the essence of God, but it is God. And he can go on for 100 pages explaining what that means. But the bottom line is, if you understand that, that's it. It's the basis for when we come to communion. We say we are truly receiving the body and blood of Christ. We are receiving God. But not God being divided. Not the essence of God, but the energies of God, the grace of God. And in another of those great words that is used all over the place in the church, but nobody really clearly defines it, the hypostatic union of Christ as man and God is this ability for God to be present without the essence of God being limited and confined. And this is why we can partake of Christ. We talk about being united with God, but we're quite strong that we're not pantheists. We're not being merged into the essence of God. We get this is still God. And if I'm not making sense, then you understand it. It is that idea that to try to understand God, to try to pursue that, is an impossible task. Now, the church has always had Epiphanic theology and Cataphatic theology, because we believe that God has made himself present in all things. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. We can get an understanding of the energy of God through all of his creation. But we still can't get to the essence. What's this mean in practice? A couple of things. First of all, there's a difference between knowing God and understanding God. The monks on Mount Athos, what we talked about is St. Patrick, who twice experienced God and had communication, propositions, go. This is knowing, this is experiencing God without knowing the essence of God. We believe that God can truly be known and that we can know God. The other thing is that there's an aspect where I would say philosophy, in one respect, is a waste of time. To go to seminary to think that you're going to know about God and learn about God and get closer to God by reading books in an academic exercise, you're fooling yourself. Because knowing God is not philosophy. In the church, knowing God is purification. It's not an intellectual exercise of how well can I think, how well can I logic, but it's how well can we purify ourselves of the passions. How much can we let go of our pride and develop humility and charity? It's a different mechanism for how we come to know God. Philosophy is valuable to understand how people in this world are thinking these days. And the church found philosophy, Maximus the Confessor, Dionysius, they were trying to talk to Greeks and Greek philosophers. So they used their words, got into their world to try to show them that their world was not right. This past Sunday, Sunday of Orthodox, and we read the statement of orthodoxy, of what we believe. That was the abbreviated version. If you really get back into the document, there's a whole list of condemnations that goes along with that. There's a whole section there of a condemnation of the philosophers. It's not necessarily popular in a lot of places to have those read. But that is what the church is saying, that Plato and Aristotle, this idea that you can reason your way to God, or at least to the concept of God, is false. It's misleading. The other aspect of this that I think is a beauty is when we say the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows his handiwork. When we say that man is made in the image of God, there's an aspect of where we can never fully know anything. We can never fully know the creation and the world. We can never fully know what humanity, what other people are. Because if you are the image of God, there's a depth and a complexity to you beyond anything that I can rationally get to. And this is not just theoretical. Gregory Petitsis, a professor at Holy Cross College, I've talked about him before. He has a book about that thick called The Ethics of Beauty. And he was struggling with the issue of post-traumatic stress syndrome, especially looking at Vietnam veterans. And what he found is when they tried to use classical Freudian psychoanalysis to try to help these people, it made them worse. Because Freud is coming out of an Enlightenment thinking that we can know things. We can be scientific, we can rationally break them down, take them apart, and figure them out. I'm not going to get into the details, but part of post-traumatic stress syndrome is this problem that a person's life has become fragmented. The things that have unified it and held it together have been destroyed. And they don't have anything to bring it together. And so to go in there with Freudian psychology and try to take a person apart even more to explain why are you behaving this way is only adding to the trauma. And it required a beauty approach. And oftentimes getting people not to contemplate what does it mean to be charitable, but to go out and help people. Don't think about it. Don't reason about it. Do it. And then I think frees us up. We need to be careful anytime we get into anything and think we can pin it down. It's the pride and hubris of our culture to think that we know things. Have a background in molecular biology, genetics. And to see over the last 30, 40 years of, they thought they know it, and then whoops, genes are more complicated than they thought. And now it's almost like every day of all of these new things and new ways that are modifiers and other things, the complexity just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. It's the danger of politics, of politicians thinking they know how to fix things. If we just do this, this will take care of the problem. And they always become more complicated and more difficult with unexpected consequences. It's a need for humility. It's almost where you, if you ever meet an elder in the church, a monastic or someone who has a deep spirituality, you go up to Mother Gabriella at Dormition Monastery and you ask for an answer. What should I do in this problem? She won't tell you. There's an aspect where the elders understand, I don't understand what's going on here, so I can't give you an answer. I can only be present in this situation. And somehow by just being who I am, I can help to change it. This, I think, is the freedom that we have. That to know God is not to think about it, to try to see how many books I can read to understand God. Father Peter sometimes talks about just be still. There are times when you just need to sit back and get all the images, all the thoughts out of your head. Don't even look at an icon, sometimes people will say, because an icon is an image, and you're going to reduce God to that image. And create a space, an emptiness. Not that God is in the emptiness, but you get rid of all the things that God is not, so that God can possibly become present and meet you and be there. And we can know him. This is what St. Patrick did. The time he spent up there in the hills, making space that God could be present with him. This is Epiphanic Theology. This is what it's talking about. Lasky, one of the older professors of St. Vladimir's, he's no longer around. He wrote a book called The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. If you want a good introduction, there's a chapter in there about Epiphanic theology that is a good, simple synopsis without getting into Gregory Palamas and reading all his and some of the other works. It's useful to understand this, but only get into it to understand it if it helps you to find that silence and that discipline, to know God, not just to get more ideas. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Early in the Divine Liturgy, not very far into it, I like it when Father is praying. He says, It's not unknowable. It's incomprehensible and unknowable, and like whose mercy is infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that part because it kind of made, when the first time I really latched onto it, it made me realize I can't even possibly comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the apophatic.
Mm-hmm. Again, you find that incomprehensible. The negative, we comprehend something, we know it and understand it. Incomprehensible is the opposite of that. But the church always pairs that with his mercy. We don't know, but we do know. And this is the mystery.
So, I guess I just want you to dive a bit deeper into what you mean when you say that God is unknowable. Because do you mean that, like, it's possible to have a true thought about God, but it's not going to circumscribe his nature? It's just going to be sort of like a partial revelation of him, or like what do you mean?
Again, this is the distinction between the essence of God versus what God has revealed to us of his energy, of his incarnation. There's a lot, we can talk about the love of God. We can talk about what God has, you read the prophets, and God talks to them and says, this is what's going to happen. That does not tell us about what God is like. That's a communication from God about something out here that we can perceive and comprehend. Christ talks about God and the love of God, but we only partially comprehend what that love is, because we talk about being infinite and beyond our comprehension. I happen to be reading Jeremiah right now, and God's confusing, even to Jeremiah, of how can you be loving and sending everybody off to Babylon, and what's going on? That the inner workings of God are beyond what we can make sense of at times. And that's okay. We can't pin him down, put him in a box, and make him predictable. So we can talk a lot of what we find revealed in Scripture, of what the fathers, of what Christ has said about God. But usually you find Christ talking about himself, not the Father. The Father's the one who sort of gets back off in the mystery a lot more. And that relationship between the persons of the Trinity is, we know it's a Trinity, but how they're interacting, they're one in an agreement, but how exactly they're doing things, it's in sort of that foggy mystery. Did that help or not?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I have one more question if no one else has one. So when we say that God is like omnipotent or omnibenevolent, so that's not like a negation saying like what God is not, right? Saying like God is all powerful, he is all good or all loving. Is the idea that like we can say like, yes, he is this, but it's not fully comprehensible, if at all, what that exactly that means. Okay.
We know what power is. We know just mechanical power, political power, different types of electricity power. But what does it mean to be all powerful? How many, how many volts is, where the mind tends to want to run for it. And they end up being nonsense questions. But it is meant to be more of the comfort that nothing is outside of God's providence control. Nothing's going to come up and be more powerful than him and derail his plans of his love for us. And if we understand that, that's sort of sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.